when that woman said, "Miracles still happen." Steve Harvey's face changed. Then what he did next became one of the most powerful moments in television history. The studio lights were blazing. The audience was cheering. The game board was flashing. Everything was exactly as it should be on another episode of Family Feud. Steve Harvey was doing what he does best, making people laugh, keeping the energy high, moving the show forward with that perfect mix of comedy and charm that had made him one of the most beloved hosts in television. But then something happened that no one in that studio, no one watching at home, and maybe not even Steve himself expected. A moment so powerful that it would stop the entire production, silence a room full of 300 people, and remind everyone watching why some stories transcend entertainment and become something far more important. This is not just a story about a game show. This is a story about faith, about loss, about hope when hope seems impossible, and about one man who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop everything and simply be human. The Johnson family had been waiting in the green room for hours. Sharon Johnson sat with her hands folded in her lap, her daughter Emily beside her, her husband Tom pacing nervously, and her mother, 72-year-old Margaret, sitting quietly with her eyes closed. They had driven 6 hours to get to the studio. They had rehearsed their answers. They had talked about strategy. But there was something else in that room, something unspoken that hung in the air like a weight none of them could shake. Sharon kept glancing at the empty chair beside her mother. The chair where her son, Daniel, should have been sitting. Daniel, who had loved Family Feud more than any show on television. Daniel, who had made them all promise that if they ever got selected to be on the show, they would go, no matter what. Daniel, who had lost his battle with leukemia just 8 months earlier at the age of 19. The production assistant had asked them the standard questions. "Are you excited? Ready to play? Any fun facts about your family we should know?" Sharon had smiled and said all the right things. But she hadn't mentioned Daniel. She couldn't. Not yet. The wound was still too fresh, the grief still too overwhelming. She had convinced herself that she could get through this, that she could honor her son's memory by being here, by playing the game he loved, by trying to find joy again even when joy seemed impossible. Steve stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The Johnson family was introduced to thunderous applause. Steve Harvey did his signature walk toward them, microphone in hand, that brilliant smile on his face. He shook hands with Tom, complimented Emily's dress, gave Margaret a gentle hug, and then he reached Sharon. "Now, Sharon," Steve said, his voice warm and welcoming. "Tell me about the Johnson family. What makes you all special?" Sharon opened her mouth to give the answer she had rehearsed. Something light, something funny, something appropriate for a game show. But when she looked into Steve Harvey's eyes, something inside her broke. Maybe it was the kindness she saw there. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying grief for so long. Maybe it was being in this place that Daniel had dreamed of, doing this thing that he would never get to do. "We're here because of my son," Sharon said, her voice already trembling. "Daniel. He loved this show more than anything. He made us promise that if we ever got the chance, we would come here and play. We would laugh. We would remember that life is still beautiful even when it's broken." The audience grew quiet. Steve's smile softened into something else, something deeper. "Where is Daniel now?" Steve asked gently. Sharon's eyes filled with tears. "He passed away 8 months ago. Leukemia. He was 19 years old." The silence in that studio was profound. 300 people holding their collective breath. Cameras still rolling but the crew behind them completely still. Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of episodes, who had heard countless family stories, who prided himself on keeping the show moving no matter what, stood perfectly still. "I'm so sorry," Steve said, and his voice carried a weight that everyone in that room could feel. "What would Daniel say if he could see you here right now?" Sharon smiled through her tears. "He would say, 'Mom, you better win. And you better make Steve laugh.'" Steve nodded slowly. He looked at Sharon, at her family standing behind her, at the opposing family who were now wiping their own eyes, at the audience that had gone from cheering to crying in the span of 60 seconds. And then Steve Harvey did something that directors and producers and network executives would later say broke every rule in the book. He stopped the show. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Hold on, Steve said, turning to the cameras. Hold on. We're going to pause for just a moment. The director's voice crackled in Steve's earpiece. Steve, we're on a schedule. We need to keep moving. Steve reached up and pulled the earpiece out. He set it on the podium. The audience gasped. This wasn't part of the show. This wasn't planned. This was Steve Harvey, one of the most professional hosts in television, breaking protocol in front of millions of viewers. I need everyone to understand something, Steve said, his voice filling the studio. We're here to play a game. We're here to have fun. We're here to win money. But before we do any of that, we need to stop and recognize what's really happening here. He walked closer to Sharon. Not as a host to a contestant. As one human being to another. You lost your son, Steve said. Your baby. 19 years old. And you're standing here, trying to honor his memory, trying to find joy again, trying to keep a promise to a child who isn't here anymore. Do you know how much strength that takes? Sharon couldn't speak. She could only nod. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Steve turned to the audience. I want everyone here to understand something. This woman, this family, they didn't have to be here today. They could have stayed home. They could have said it's too hard, it's too soon, it's too painful. But they didn't. They came here because a young man named Daniel loved this show, and they loved him enough to keep his dream alive even after he's gone. The audience erupted in applause. Not the performative applause of a game show audience, but something real, something from the soul. People were standing. Strangers were holding hands. The opposing family stepped away from their podium and walked over to the Johnsons, embracing them one by one. Steve Harvey watched this unfold, and those who knew him well could see something happening in his expression. Steve had built an empire on making people laugh. He had hosted Miss Universe pageants and talk shows and comedy specials. He had written books about success and relationships and faith. But in this moment, he was confronting something that his success and his fame couldn't fix, the raw reality of human loss. Margaret, Sharon's mother, stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but clear. Mr. Harvey, can I say something? Steve immediately handed her the microphone. Of course, ma'am. Please. Margaret looked at her daughter, at her granddaughter, at the audience, and then at Steve. When Daniel was in the hospital, during his last week, he was in so much pain. But he would still watch Family Feud every day. We would bring a little TV into his room, and he would watch your show, and for 30 minutes, he would forget about the pain. He would laugh at your jokes. He would yell at the contestants when they gave bad answers. He would smile. Her voice broke. You gave my grandson joy in his darkest moments. You didn't know him. You didn't know he existed. But you were there for him every single day. And now we're here, and I just want you to know that you made a difference in a life that ended too soon. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Steve Harvey stood there, this man who had entertained millions, who had built a career on confidence and charisma, and tears rolled down his face. He didn't try to hide them. He didn't make a joke to break the tension. He just let himself feel it. I need to tell you something, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. I do this show because it's fun. I do it because it pays well. I do it because I like making people happy. But I never, ever considered that somewhere out there, in a hospital room, a young man fighting for his life was watching me and finding even a moment of peace. He looked directly at Margaret. You just gave me a gift, ma'am. You just told me that my work mattered in a way I never imagined. Daniel's life mattered. His love for this show mattered. And you being here today matters more than any game we could play. Then Steve Harvey did something that would become the image that defined this moment, The photograph that would be shared millions of times, the gesture that would be talked about for years. He took off his jacket. His custom-tailored, perfectly fitted, signature Steve Harvey jacket. He walked over to Sharon and held it out to her. "This jacket," Steve said, "has been with me through hundreds of shows. It's been in this studio, on this stage, making memories with families just like yours. I want you to have it. Not to wear. Not to keep in a closet. But to hold on to on the days when grief feels too heavy. On the days when you need to remember that Daniel's love is still here. On the days when you need to be reminded that miracles still happen." Sharon took the jacket with shaking hands. She held it against her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Miracles still happen," she whispered. "Even when it doesn't feel like it. Even when we've lost so much. Miracles still happen." The phrase hung in the air. Miracles still happen. It wasn't denial. It wasn't toxic positivity. It was something deeper, the acknowledgement that even in the aftermath of unimaginable loss, beauty could still break through. Love could still be felt. Joy could still be found, even if it came wrapped in tears. Steve nodded. "Yes, they do. And you being here today, honoring your son, keeping his memory alive, finding the strength to stand on this stage, that's a miracle. You are the miracle, Sharon." The game continued eventually. The Johnsons played, and they laughed, and they won their round. But no one watching would remember the questions or the answers or the points. They would remember the moment when Steve Harvey stopped being a host and became a witness to grief, to love, to the resilience of the human spirit. Share this story and subscribe. Make sure this moment is never forgotten. After the show wrapped, after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience filed out, Steve Harvey sat alone in his dressing room. The jacket he had given away had been with him for years. It had been expensive. It had been fitted specifically for him. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that somewhere, a family was driving home with that jacket, and every time they looked at it, they would remember that their grief had been witnessed, their son had been honored, and their pain had been met with compassion instead of being rushed through for the sake of a television schedule. Steve's assistant knocked on the door. "Steve, that was incredible. The producers want to talk about what happened." Steve smiled. "Let them talk. Sometimes you have to break the rules to do what's right." In the weeks that followed, the episode aired. Social media exploded. The clip went viral. Millions of people watched Sharon Johnson say, "Miracles still happen," and saw Steve Harvey respond with humanity instead of showmanship. Comments poured in from people who had lost children, from families struggling with grief, from viewers who had never considered that a game show could become a sacred space. But the real impact happened in the quieter places. In the hospital rooms where sick children watched Steve Harvey and found 30 minutes of relief from their pain. In the living rooms where grieving families gathered and felt less alone. In the hearts of people who realized that sometimes the most important thing we can do is stop, witness another person's pain, and respond with simple, honest compassion. 3 months after the episode aired, Steve Harvey received a letter. It was from Emily, Sharon's daughter, Daniel's sister. She wrote about how the jacket hung in their living room now, how her mother would sometimes just sit and look at it when the grief felt overwhelming, how it had become a symbol not just of Steve's kindness but of their family's commitment to keep living, keep loving, keep finding joy even in the aftermath of devastating loss. "You didn't just give us a jacket," Emily wrote. "You gave us permission to grieve publicly, to honor Daniel openly, to say his name and tell his story without shame or apology. You showed us that our pain doesn't have to be hidden, that our love for Daniel doesn't have to be silent, that miracles can look like kindness from a stranger on a television stage." Steve Harvey kept that letter in his desk drawer. And on the days when the pressures of fame and success felt overwhelming, when the entertainment industry demanded more and more and more, he would read it and remember. Sometimes the most important moment of your career isn't the one that gets you an award or a raise or a headline. It's the moment when you stop everything, break every rule, and simply see another human being in their pain and say, "I see you. Your story matters. Your love matters. And miracles still happen.